It's a privilege for me to be here together with these distinguished two colleagues, Irakun and Ramon. We visited Bilbao in the summertime, and it was a privilege, and it was a huge experience to see what you have done. I am actually living in a city where we had a shipyard, one of the biggest shipyards in the world actually, and now we have none whatsoever. Sweden was the second largest shipbuilding nation in the world in the 70s, and I started working actually on a shipyard, but now we have none as well. And you have managed to succeed in Bilbao, and we are trying to do it as well. And I think that shows the experience of subsidizing different industries, production, and we should be cautious doing that. Guggenheim is, of course, an extremely well-known example of how to modernize and rebuild a city. To Ramon, I would say that I've always liked Barcelona. I've been there several times. My close friend Carlos Gasoliba. And I also, together with my son, watched the football team, of course. And I must say, I'm coming from Malmö, and you just sold Zlatan Ibrahimovic. That was a pity for us, but I hope that you will reckon that that was a loss anyway. And I got tickets for the Barca game in Copenhagen in a couple of weeks. As you know, we experienced the worst actually depression since the Great Depression in the 30s. And I think that this shows that actually we have to have a global approach. And I think that we have done reasonably well. There are always pessimists, and I'm used to say that I'm a liberal, so I'm an optimist. And I do think that even though the downturn was very sharp and very rapid, I think that you can see now that we have some light in the tunnel. And I do think that is actually important. If you are not saying that it's going in the right direction, psychologically, no one will say anything else. And I do think that you can see that the result is improving. One of the important consequences of the word financial crisis has been the serious deterioration of the fiscal position of governments around the world. And the ability to handle this crisis, as in previous crises, has been different for central governments and regional and local governments in Europe, I would say. Without sufficient ability to borrow money, regional governments facing some combination of lower own source revenues, cuts in transfers from the governments, and reductions in the value of their assets will find themselves in a very difficult situation, as you mentioned yourself. The most significant direct impact of the crisis has been on the regional and, I would say, local level and composition of local governments' finances on both the revenue and expenditure side of their budgets. It has been a problem. Local governments in many countries have also been forced to reduce current expenditures, not only for maintenance and operation, but also for some categories that have been relatively unaffected in past crises. I think we can see that as well, such as social services and creating a huge unemployment. There is also another reason to be concerned. The crisis may have a negative, I say may have a negative impact of decentralization and local governance. If budgets are reduced due to revenue shortfalls, local governments will be less able to meet their important responsibilities and will face an erosion of citizens' trust. I am living in an extremely centralized country. You are not. You are happy not to do that. But the crisis has affected all of us. At the same time, some countries, such as my own, have recognized the need to keep resources flowing to local governments during the crisis because of the important roles they play in service delivery and the promotion of economic government. I would say that why I'm saying this is that my party is a part of the government, so I think they mostly are doing the right things. Mostly, I said. One key question I think has to be raised. Should municipalities, which probably have the least elastic spending among levels of government, fully bear their share of a drop in revenues in consolidated government revenues? There is a risk of ill-conceived structural reforms being pushed through under the pretext of dealing with a crisis, for example, re-centralizing services or reducing local autonomy for the sake of realizing cost reductions. And I think we will also address that in this afternoon. I think that there is a considerable need for more systematic analysis of the impact of the current crisis on local government finances. Such efforts would help central and local governments not only to better understand the depth of the nature of the problems being experienced, but also point to innovative ways that have allowed some local governments to cope with the crisis better than others. There are, to conclude, many lessons to be learned from the recent financial crisis, an economic and social crisis. The crisis had revealed gaps in some areas, and I will mention three: in legislation, in supervision, and in crisis management. We are dealing with all these issues in this House, as you know. And the question is merely if more regulation at EU level is really the answers to our questions. And my answer to that is a bit doubtful, and at least Ramon knows that I'm not in favor of regulating everything. I strongly believe we need a better regulation and a better legislation. Better regulation in the case of financial markets means increasing the transparency while avoiding provisions having a negative impact on market efficiency and thereby impairing the growth potential of the wider economy. Let me conclude by saying that I was in Parliament in Stockholm in the 90s, and we had a tremendous downturn. We were in the deepest crisis that our country has ever been in. We had an interest rate of 500%. And at that time, the governor of the central bank came every day to the Standing Committee of Finance and said, do something, do something. And we tried, but we didn't succeed. And in the end, he had a proposal of lifting the interest rate to 2,000%. But at that time, we thought that this was too close to be a banana republic, and we didn't want that to happen. And at that time, we introduced, after this enormous crash, a couple of proposals that actually is now being proposed in the whole of the European Union, about budgets, stricter budgets, and so on, and ex-ante provisions of examining the budgets and so on, and not giving the parliamentarians too much maneuver to add more costs to the national budget. Was this good or bad? This was, well, the question is wrongly put. It was necessary. Otherwise, the country would have collapsed. And therefore, of course, when we are examining this period in the Swedish history, you could say, well, they are very clever, those Swedes up in the north. But that is not the case. Some of us might, or some of others might be. But we had the problem, and we had to solve them. So the crisis actually created some innovative thinking. So therefore, we are better off at the moment. It's not that we are better skilled for dealing with crisis, not at all. We were the worst ones. But we had it in the 90s, so now we are better off. And perhaps some of the other countries could learn of this, but it's not because we were especially clever. That's what I say in a humble way, because we were so hard hit, and hopefully fellow countries and fellow members of this parliament will see that their countries will not be as hard hit as my country were in the 90s. I will stop there by saying, as I said, I'm an optimist, and I would say that we're going to solve this. We're going to solve this in Europe, and we're going to solve it in a decent manner, both taking care of the local and regional level.